This morning, the search is over for the man suspected of shooting nearly a dozen people inside the New York City subway.
62-year-old Frank James will face a judge later today. He was arrested in Manhattan yesterday after investigators say he called police on himself. James is facing federal charges in Tuesday morning's shooting on a Brooklyn subway. 10 people were shot. 13 others were hurt while escaping the train. New York City's mayor had this message for the city following his capture.
My fellow New Yorkers, we got him. We got him.
NBC News correspondent Von Hillier joins us from outside the Brooklyn Federal Court, where Frank James will be later today. So, Von, this was a nearly 30-hour manhunt for James. It turns out he's the one who actually called a tip line to let police know his whereabouts. What happened when police finally got him into custody, and then what are the charges he's facing now?
Joe, we're in quite a different place than we were yesterday morning when there was a manhunt across the greater New York City for Frank James here. But now we find ourselves looking at a court appearance by the gentleman from Philadelphia area here later this afternoon. He is set facing a count of knowingly committing a violent attack with a dangerous weapon on mass transportation. There are individuals that are still recovering here today, 2 days later. I want to let you take a listen, though, to the NYPD police commissioner talk about the moments around his arrest.
Frank Robert James was stopped on the street and arrested by members of the New York City Police Department. Officers, in response to a Crime Stoppers tip, stopped Mr. James at 1:42 p.m. at the corner of St. Mark's Place and First Avenue in Manhattan. We hope this arrest brings some solace to the victims and the people of the city of New York.
Three sources, police officials, tell our WNBC colleague Jonathan Deans that upon the police officers arriving to the scene there, that Frank James told them he had been waiting for them. And this took place just around the East Village neighborhood in Manhattan, just across the river from where we are standing now, where there was much attention turned around those busy Manhattan streets around his arrest.
So, Von, we've sort of seen this investigation play out as it was unfolding, police giving us more and more information. What kind of evidence do police have? What have they collected in this case?
You know, ultimately, it was about 30 hours from the time of the attack to the moment of his arrest. And looking at the police affidavit that they have released, there is much evidence that puts Frank James at the heart of this. Number one, there was the U-Haul keys that were found at the site of the attack on that subway. Those U-Haul keys belong to a U-Haul that was rented out the previous afternoon, Monday afternoon, in Philadelphia by Frank James. There was also the 9mm Glock that was found on the subway. There was an attempt, apparently, to scratch out the serial number on that Glock, but authorities were able to work with the ATF to identify it. And that Glock was purchased back in 2011 in Ohio by Frank James. There are also multiple properties attached to bank cards that were also found on that subway, attached to Frank James. There is surveillance video that we are now looking at of that U-Haul in the early morning hours, around 4 a.m., crossing over into Brooklyn. And there's another surveillance footage of apparently Frank James getting out of that U-Haul and approaching the subway station where he began a few stops away from ultimately where that attack took place.
All right, Von Hilliard. Von, thank you so much.
Now, like Von just reported, investigators are charging Frank James with committing a violent attack on mass transportation. Here's how the FBI described the shooting after the arrest.
Mr. James is now facing a federal charge for his actions, a terrorist attack on mass transit.
Let's bring in NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalas to help us understand what's next in the investigation. And I want to pick up with that very specific word we just heard there, terrorist, a terrorist attack on mass transit. But Danny, the FBI, it's important to note here that legally he's not being charged with terrorism. It's not listed in his federal charge. So why is he not charged with a terrorist attack right now? And does that comment from the FBI signal that more charges could be coming, or was it something that was just said?
Simply put, the concept of domestic terrorism occupies a gray area in American law. We certainly have international terrorism laws, but when it comes to domestic terrorism, we have a constellation of different federal criminal statutes that the FBI and the government use. But in a case like this, typically what the government will do is go with the layup charge first, one they feel very confident they can prove. I'm not so sure that terrorism charges aren't completely excluded yet. They could be added on later. But if you look at this particular statute, it carries a potential life sentence, and if somebody dies, death. But fortunately, there were no resulting deaths. So it's a very considerable federal statute that criminalizes this kind of act of violence on a subway or a train or something of mass transportation.
Now, Danny, from this surveillance video that we've seen that shows the suspect, the police say, swiping through, trying to get into the train station, there's that video right there, and then to this bag that was left behind on the subway. Investigators say they have evidence that links James to the shooting, puts him at this scene. But now the big question, the motive. How do they work on determining that?
Motive is going to be important to them, but again, it's not really important in terms of proving the case beyond a reasonable doubt, because typically motive is not a necessary element of most crimes. And that may be why you're not seeing more aggressive terrorism type charges yet, because when you start charging certain crimes that require you to prove a motive, for example, whether the act was intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, that can be a little harder. Instead, you go with a charge like this one, where you have an act of violence on a mass transportation thing like a subway, and that's an easier charge to make out. It still gets you to the government's promised land, which is a conviction and a likely life sentence.
And now, Danny, investigators say that Frank James actually called the police on himself, said he was at a McDonald's. What kind of impact could that move have on the case? And if and when he goes to trial, what will that mean?
From a prosecutor's point of view, I mean, those phone calls, that phone call to police will certainly be an admission that they will try to introduce against him. It will only help the government case. But then the government is also helped by the same thing that local police and the federal government is aided by so much in today's criminal prosecution, which is substantial video and the digital wake of evidence that we all leave when we move through the world. So the government has that in its corner. And I guess a phone call from the suspect saying, "I'm here," would be a cherry on top.
Danny Savalos, as always, we appreciate you. Thank you so much.
If you're flying over the next 2.5 weeks, you're still going to need that mask. The CDC updated its guidance for mask mandates on public transportation, including commercial airplanes and trains. The CDC announced that the TSA is extending the security directive and emergency amendment for 15 days through May 3rd. It was originally set to expire on Monday. The decision comes despite recent calls from airline CEOs to drop the mask mandate on planes. But the CDC pointed to the rising number of cases in several states as a reason to keep the mandate in place. Dr. Susanna Hills joins us now for more on this. She's a pediatric airway surgeon at the Columbia University Medical School. Dr. Hills, good to have you with us. So first of all, remind us, why are masks important while traveling on public transportation? What makes those spaces such a high risk for COVID transmission?
Yes, well, there are excellent filtration systems on airplanes, but you just can't get around the fact that you're sitting with inches of people in front and back and either side of you when you're on an airplane. And generally that close proximity when you're flying is for a number of hours. So it really is an increased chance of transmission in an enclosed environment like that with prolonged potential contact. So I really think that extending the mask mandate for travel in this moment does make sense. We are seeing case numbers go up. They've gone up around 8 to 9% in the last 2 weeks. So we just need a little bit of time to monitor this. And in areas with close proximity like that, it does make sense to be cautious.
Dr. President Biden also extended what's known as the National COVID Public Health Emergency Declaration for another 90 days. What does that mean, and is it still necessary for our fight against COVID?
Yes, well, really, this extension gives people the benefit of resources that we've been able to provide, like telemedicine and like access to COVID testing. So it's really keeping these services open for people for the next 90 days, giving people a little extra support in the event that what we're seeing now with this increase in cases really turns into a surge that will be coming. So I think it's great to kind of keep these services in play for another few months to make sure that that we have access to extra testing, access to additional services, and we'll see how things go in the next few months with this BA2 variant.
Yeah, I mean, and doctor, right now, I mean, the new CDC data shows 90% of COVID cases in the Northeast are that highly contagious BA2 Omicron subvariant. So we know Philadelphia is bringing back its indoor mask mandate. Do you think other cities should follow that example? And then when it comes to schools, I mean, should parents be worried about their kids at school?
Yeah, that is really an excellent question, Joe. And I was surprised. I think a lot of people were surprised to see Philadelphia be back in a situation where they have to implement the mask mandate again. But it's really a matter of the cases, and their cases have gone up around 50% recently. So it's a really significant increase. The key to knowing how concerned to be and when to implement these mandates again is with testing and keeping on top of the case numbers. And then following that, keeping on top of hospitalizations and mortalities that tend to follow weeks to a month or so later. So keeping on top of testing, keeping on top of the numbers will really give us an indicator of when other cities might need to implement mask mandates again. Again, this is going to be an ongoing issue that we're going to confront probably for years to come. And so we just need to be flexible in knowing that, yes, mandates probably will come and go, masking will come and go, and I think it'll just be part of our fabric of our public health measures in the future to come and go with these things.
All right, Dr. Susanna Hills, thank you so much.
Let's turn now to the war in Ukraine, where a Russian warship in the Black Sea has suffered major damage by a blast. Now, Russia's defense ministry says crew on its flagship Moskva vessel have been evacuated, blaming the damage on an onboard ammunition explosion and fire. The Ukrainians, though, say they struck the ship with missiles. NBC News has not been able to verify either account. All that comes as Ukraine reopened some humanitarian corridors today, which have been closed on Wednesday. Most of the routes are in the eastern part of the country, which is bracing for a Russian onslaught. Yesterday, the United States announced a new $800 million military aid package, which it says will help Ukraine in the battles ahead.
This authorization is the 7th such drawdown of equipment from DoD inventories for Ukraine since August of 2021. Some of them are reinforcing capabilities that we have already been providing Ukraine, and some of them are new capabilities that we have not provided to Ukraine. All of them are designed to help Ukraine, as we talked about, help Ukraine in the fight that they are in right now, and the fight that they will be in coming days and weeks in the eastern part of the country.
NBC News national correspondent Gabe Gutierrez joins us now from a town just west of the capital of Kyiv. Hey, Gabe, good to see you. So I want to start off first with these conflicting reports we're getting about what happened to that Russian flagship in the Black Sea. So Ukrainians and the Russians, again, are both giving these different accounts. Tell us what we do know, though, right now, and just how important this warship is for Russia's fleet.
Well, Savannah, it is a significant blow to the Russian war effort in the Black Sea. As you said, this is a flagship warship, essentially, very significant for the Russian war effort. But right now, as you said, there are these conflicting reports. The Russians say that there was some sort of fire, that they're investigating the cause of that fire. But just hours earlier, the Ukrainians had come out and said that their cruise missiles had actually inflicted this damage. So neither account can be independently verified at this point. But this all comes, Savannah, as the fighting is expected to increase both to the south and the east as this war grinds on.
Yeah, so Gabe, I mean, the east, that's where we're talking about these humanitarian corridors. The situation is just dire in places like Mariupol. They're back open today after they were closed yesterday. What's the latest there, and the broader eastern region bracing for that assault? How are they planning to get people out?
Well, Savannah, we've been speaking about Mariupol now for weeks, that besieged city, depending on who you ask. President Zelensky several days ago said that it's likely tens of thousands of people could die there. Local officials say the death toll could be as high as 20,000. All that is impossible to verify at this point. But Russia is claiming that just recently more than 1,000 Ukrainian troops surrendered in that besieged city. Again, that claim can't be verified, but a U.S. senior defense official is saying that at this point, the belief is that the Russians have not been able to take that besieged city, Savannah.
And Gabe, I do want to ask you about the town that you're in right now. So this is one of those places in the Kyiv region, as I mentioned when we introduced you, that Ukraine recaptured from the Russians as the Russians moved out of the region to prepare for that eastern assault. What is it like on the ground there as we've seen these troops leave? This is when we've been seeing what investigators are saying could be war crimes. What kind of discoveries are they making there?
Well, Savannah, it has been devastating to witness this area over the last several days. In this town, Makariv is where I am. The belief is that, more than 100 people died. This is not too far from Bucha, where we've been hearing about those alleged war crimes there. But, if you look over here, Savannah, this is actually what's left of a kindergarten. Yes, a kindergarten, Savannah. And this is actually the second such kindergarten that we have witnessed bombed out like this over the last several days. Thankfully, though, none of the students here, more than 100 of them, were actually inside the building at the time. They had actually evacuated when the war started. But we've spoken with the principal here. She just cannot understand, Savannah, how this can be confused for a military target. Obviously, it is a civilian target. There's this playground right here. All of it is obliterated. Now, today, there are local residents here starting to clean up the damage. But as you can see, it will take a long time to rebuild this. They are still finding bodies in this part of Ukraine. They are going through this area looking for booby traps, tripwires, and landmines. We were in a nearby village here just this morning where there is also an effort. They just have been finding bodies over the last several days, and residents there have been devastated. Those nearby villages had been occupied by the Russians. This area, Makariv, this particular city center, they managed to hold the Russians off, but only just barely. And they are just so relieved that they have now retreated. But the fighting, as we've been reporting, is now intensifying in the east and the south, and there is just so much unprocessed trauma here. It will last for generations, Savannah.
Yeah, Gabe, you understand why there's confusion from that principal in terms of it being confused for a target, given that swing set right there among the rubble. Thank you so much, Gabe. Stay safe.
Let's get more on Ukraine with John Herbst. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Ambassador, let's talk about this new $800 million military aid package for Ukraine. It includes heavy artillery, which Washington says is going to help Ukraine with the upcoming fight in the east. So what does this package tell us about the kind of battle we're likely to see next? And do you think the U.S. will continue to supply Ukraine with arms for as long as it takes, even if it's a year or longer?
Well, first, this package is a good contribution to Ukraine's efforts to defend itself. And Ukraine needs a great deal of help because the Russians are now going to be conducting mass operations with many tanks, supported by their Air Force, supported by their armored personnel carriers on relatively open terrain. And as your military analyst, as your reporter noted, Ukrainians have been dug in the east, so the Russians can easily come in behind them with these forces. So it's good to see that we're sending the 155 artillery. That's very important. But there are things the Ukrainians have asked for which we're not providing, which they desperately need. They need multiple rocket launcher systems, which we have. The administration should also change its position on the MiG fighters because the Ukrainians need those to attack the columns that will be attacking them. I am confident the administration will continue in the long haul to supply Ukraine, but I'm afraid the administration continues to be very, very slow and tentative at sending what Ukraine needs. They send this week what they should have sent 2 months ago. They need to change that dynamic.
I want to get your reaction on those comments from President Biden accusing President Putin of committing genocide in Ukraine. The Kremlin called the allegations unacceptable. French President Emmanuel Macron refused to use the term, saying he didn't believe, quote, an escalation of rhetoric would serve the cause of peace. What's your reaction to all this?
Well, first, I think President Biden was just reflecting the evidence. There's increasing views within the expert community familiar with genocide, like Professor Bartoff at Brown University, Eugene Finkel, who did an op-ed in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago, that in fact what we're seeing in Ukraine is Russian genocide. A, because they've been attacking civilians, which is a war crime, but B, because the Russian media have been saying things about the need to de-Ukrainize Ukraine. That's the definition of genocide, to take away people's identity. And even the former president of Russia, Medvedev, has said rather similar things. So the evidence is there. But to be honest, I think it would be much better if instead of accusing Putin of committing genocide, which is not false, we were sending the weapons that would help Ukraine defeat the Russians. This is sort of like talking loudly and not carrying a big enough stick. We need to give Ukrainians a stick, which we have, so they can beat the Russians.
Quickly on this last one, Ambassador, yesterday the UN Secretary General said he doesn't think a global ceasefire in Ukraine is possible at the moment. We know Putin recently said peace talks are at a dead end. What role does diplomacy play right now?
I think we should keep open our diplomatic channels. The Ukrainians should keep open the diplomatic channels to Russia. But this is not the stage for diplomacy. Putin just doubled down and said we will defeat them on the battlefield. And again, given the horrors that Russian occupation has put on Ukrainian civilians, given their genocidal statements, I can understand why Ukraine knows they have to fight. So we need to give Ukraine the weapons to fight effectively.
All right, Ambassador, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Time to get a check on your morning news now weather.
Michelle Grossman joins us now. Hey, Michelle, good morning.
Good morning to you both, and we're going to see a quieter day. So let's start out with that. We had a really busy night overnight. We had 217 wind reports. One of those places was Tennessee, where we saw structural damage. We saw really heavy rain throughout the night, and we saw some tornado reports as well through the Tennessee Valley. You can see the fences sort of bent and the water really high. And we're going to see isolated severe weather today, but nothing like what we've seen Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So that's the good news. Let's go ahead and take a look at radar, show you what's happening right now. For the first time in a long time, we can say we don't have any severe warnings, watches right now. You can clearly make out where that cold front is, though. That swirl in the upper Midwest. On the backside, we still have snow. We have blizzard warnings still in the northern plains. You see that trailing cold front where you see the green through the Ohio Valley into the Gulf Coast. And we're seeing heavy rain, but most of that right now is over the Gulf. So that's good news, too. Now, as we go throughout time here, we're looking at 28 million Americans at risk for severe weather today. As opposed to Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we're looking at isolated chances, though. And it looks like the biggest threats will be wind damage. So Hartford, New York City, Philadelphia, also eastern Pennsylvania, where you see the yellow here, you're at a slight risk for severe weather this afternoon and evening. And this is the setup. We have that cold front that's trekking to the east. We've dealt with it all week long, and we'll finally move off the coast later on this afternoon. But before that, we're going to see the chance for heavy rain and some gusty winds as it makes its way along the east coast. Your rainfall forecast, not a whole lot like what we've seen, but we still could see some isolated flooding with locally up to 1 inch. But generally, we're going to see a quarter inch to a half inch of rain. And that's good news because we're saturated already. We'll end here with a blizzard warning through tonight, where you see the purple here. We could see an additional 5 inches of snow with winds gusting to 50 miles per hour. Back to you guys.
All right, a blizzard. My goodness. All right. Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.